Welcome to Words on Wednesdays. This week I'm talking about plotting. And not like plotting against someone, but talking about like plot, like how to get from A to B and where your story is going. Especially for first-time writers and even for people like me who have been writing for decades, it can sometimes be tricky dealing with plot. There's a lot of different guides and different tools you can use to help you with plotting. Some of the ones you may have heard of may include Dan Harmon's Circle or the Pixar's rules for writing. And like basically every person who writes, I think, has their own kind of guide for writing. There's a lot of different ones and you can look at them to get help figuring out where you're going if you're stuck. The simplest form of any story breakdown, it's going to look a bit like a mountain range. You should have rising action and falling action. And all of that, and it'll go up a little bit until you reach the peak, which is the climax, and then it goes down. What is that called? And basically every story fits into that. Anything that's complex and action-packed, and even things that are slow-moving, you know, from Remains of the Day to Terminator, they all follow a similar formula where there's going to be inciting actions, it's going to rise a little bit, and then it's going to go down, and so on. What your job as an author is to like kind of pick what those points will be. I plan on going on more in depth with outlines because I have like a big love-hate relationship with them right now, and so I will have like a whole video where I just talk about that in depth. But I think that most writers, no matter how seat of the pants they are, tend to have some general outlines, even if it's just a few bullet points of what they expect to happen in the story. I think it depends on what's driving you to write the story. Usually I have kind of a scene in mind. There's something there that I want to write, and I basically start with that. My initial brainstorming starts with usually characters. I've got a couple characters and ideas, and I go vaguely out from there. It can be, and it usually is not a lot to begin with, but then I start basically, it's kind of like a word cloud brainstorming thing. I'm just writing down a few words, maybe lyrics, ideas. Sometimes it's just like little snapshots of stuff I have. For example, some of the initial brainstorm ideas that I had for the Trill trilogy were girl with powers that she doesn't understand, forbidden romance. The initial story idea for it that grew from it is that her mom called her a monster, and her mom turned out to be kind of right. And so that was the initial idea, and I wanted to kind of play with that and flip it on its head a little bit, because her mom was sort of right in that Wendy's not human, but her mom was wrong in that Wendy was a monster and deserves to be killed. So I kind of wanted to play around with who's right and who's wrong and what the truth is. And so that was my initial concept for the story, was building on that initial kernel, and then I knew I wanted to have forbidden romance, and I really wanted to have like ball dance scenes. I love ball dance scenes, like all of my, like a ball gown and a big, all of that, love it. So it's kind of like whatever is driving you, and you build a plot around that. I personally generally like to have character-driven books, and I think that my most successful books are the ones that are most character-driven. The ones where I focus too much on world building, or we'll say a lot on world building. I won't say too much, it doesn't have to be a negative, but there are some that are more character-driven and some that are more world-driven. My world-driven books are not as popular. And so I think that people like connecting with characters. And it also feels, I think, more exciting because you're going to have more reaction. And one thing that I think it's important to be cautious of, especially as first-time writers, and I mean, I still get stuck doing it too, is making sure that your main character or characters aren't always just reacting to things. Especially a lot of times you have an inciting event, like something happens, like aliens land or something, but so your character is reacting to the aliens landing, and having that happen sometimes, or even as the inciting event, isn't a problematic. It's if every time they're reacting. Sometimes they need to be proactive. Sometimes they need to be the thing that sets the motion in. They make a decision, and then the plot changes as a result of their decision and their actions. But sometimes, yeah, they should be reacting. But if it feels like they always are, the book becomes too passive, and readers kind of tend to be less invested in that. And of course, there's always exceptions to the rule that break that, absolutely. So don't always, any rule I say or any suggestion I have, these are just suggestions that may help you, or it's something to think about. None of these are hard and fast rules. Every rule I say, there is definitely a great book that has broken it. So keep that in mind, but also realize that most books that do break it struggle, I guess. So I mean, it's something that don't be afraid to try new things or to push outside it, but also, think about things. It's just stuff to consider, stuff to help you. They're just tools, but they should never hold you back. If it's holding you back, then get rid of it. You don't need that tool. That's how I feel. I do think it's important when you're writing to kind of have a rough idea of where you think the story is going to end, but it's also okay to not know the ending, and it's okay if the ending changes. Sometimes you're writing things and you think a book is going to go one way and it goes another. I've had that happen a few times, and I think it's ultimately been better for the books. And I think that the times where I've been too rigid and forced the book to stick with my original idea have been contrary to what the books needed. But I think that that's more my nature to second guess myself. So you're going to have to look at your own strengths and weaknesses and see, am I someone who's always second guessing myself, or am I someone who's overly confident? And then kind of look at, where do you need to push yourself more, or do you need to pull back? I mean, you should probably always push yourself more though, really, right? So, and also sometimes if you're getting stuck when you're writing and you don't know where the story is going, two things that I've done that have helped me is, if I don't know where the story is going, sometimes I'd say you can figure out what you definitely don't want to happen next. Say, well, I don't want to do this. They're not going to do that. And if you start kind of waiting out what's not going to happen, it can help you kind of figure out what is going to happen. You're going to also look at what is the most obvious thing to happen, what is the most unexpected thing to happen, and kind of play around with different things like that to figure out what works best for your character and your story. But it's important that you stay true to your story and your character instead of just doing something that's cool or unexpected. It still needs to be true to what's already happening in the world. The other thing that I do if I'm kind of stuck is sometimes, especially if I sometimes get an issue where I know what happens on chapter 1 and I know what happens in chapter 3, but chapter 2 is like a mystery. And sometimes I don't know how I'm going to bridge the two, and sometimes I just skip writing chapter 2 and I start at chapter 3 and I figure out where I start and get to the end of chapter 3, and then that figures out what I need. Sometimes that means that even chapter 2 can be eliminated and I was having too much extraneous stuff going on, and that's why I was getting stuck, is because nothing was happening. I found for myself too, if I'm getting bored writing a scene, there's a chance that readers might get bored. So I need to look at it and say, what is making me bored? 9 times out of 10, it's either because I don't want to describe, like I've been describing too much stuff, or the scene is actually kind of redundant. Like I've written a similar chapter recently and I'm rehashing or doing something like that. I'm kind of over explaining. I think that's actually, for me, it's usually that I've got stuck in a loop over explaining. And so for me, one thing that I can do if that's the case is I can actually cut it, because I was being ridiculous to begin with. And that sucks sometimes, especially if you have like interesting nuggets or bits in there. If you can pull sentences out and save them and tuck them somewhere in later, but you don't need to keep a whole passage in there just because there was a couple of glimmering bits. That's kind of how my editing and revision works a lot, is some stuff gets shifted and pulled around, and I have to cut a lot because I do end up being redundant and I over explain. I want to make sure everyone understands everything. And that can be a positive and that can be a negative for sure. But these are my strengths and weaknesses. If you're someone who under-explains, then that advice would be terrible for you. I also try not to, in the first drafts, I mean, this is still kind of, I think, in the form of plotting, I try not to get too bogged down on word choices in the first draft. Sentences can be clunky or run on or whatever. The important thing for me is to get the bones of the story out, and there's a certain drive when I've got a story idea and where just like I have to get it out on paper, and I like to not lose that drive. And so what's most important for me personally is to keep the motivation, to get the bones out and make sure that I'm putting words out. And it's so much easier for me to revise and go back and look through and say, oh my god, you've used the same word 8 times in 3 paragraphs, than it is for me to write and interrupt the flow. And that can interrupt my ideas for plotting and stuff too, because I'm not paying attention to where the story is going, because I get so focused on the micro details. So I think for your first draft, really focus on the macro and getting to the end and figuring out the plot, and then you go back to the beginning and you go through and start looking at it on a more smaller micro level. Sorry, I need to drink water there. So those are some of my writing tips and my tips for plotting. I'll be back next week with the new Writing on Wednesday videos. Also, on Monday, I'm going to have a return of Musings on Monday. The first time that I did that, I talked about my musings and my thoughts on my own books, but this time I'm going to be doing reviews of other people's books. Well, thoughts and reviews of other people's books. I'm going to do reviews of mostly of books. I might do like the occasional movie or video game or TV show or something like that, but my main focus is going to be my thoughts on books. So I'll be starting this Monday with a book that I have been dying to read, and I hadn't let myself until I got ready, but so I'm excited. So watch out for Monday for Musings on Monday, and I'll be back next week with more writing tips. As always, feel free to leave comments or questions if you have any other things you want to know about writing, and I'll talk about them in future videos. Thank you again for tuning in, and happy writing. If you like this video, please hit like and hit subscribe for more videos.